Welcome back, everyone. I don't know how everyone's feeling, but I'm feeling super inspired. It's been such an amazing conference, and every conference I just learned so much. So I'd like our panelists to switch on their camera, please, if that's at all possible. Kate! Kate and I know each other in real life. Which is like a rarity these days. I've met so many people virtually. It's really good to see someone that you actually know in real life. How are you doing?
I'm good, and part of the reason I'm here, I mean, you've got a lot to answer for getting me involved with quite a lot of things in the past.
But you do such a great job, you know, you're just so fantastic. So would you like to introduce yourself and describe yourself, because we've got a visually impaired person in the audience, please?
Okay, my name is Kate. I'm fairly recognizable everywhere. I've got really bright red, quite striking hair. I'm 51 years old, and yeah, that's me as a description. As to what I do, is that where you want me to go now? Give you a bit of a background of where I am and what I do? Okay, so I'm regional officer for the LGBT education charity Diversity Role Models. I'm part of the education team there. We develop many resources to support young LGBT people, and also to support staff in trying to make their schools more inclusive in any way they possibly can. I'm also part of the committee at Schools Out UK, and have been now for quite a few years. And I'm also part of the LGBT plus independent expert panel to Welsh Government. When
do you sleep? Because you're also in a rock band.
I do that as well, yeah, but yeah, I don't sleep is the answer.
Thank you, Kate. I'm now going to leave the panel in your capable hands, and I'll see you in 45 minutes. I just want to thank everyone for attending and everyone for their contributions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so just seeing, do I need to pin myself up there for a minute? Yeah, just before we start, I think we can get everybody in some sort of other view, or Lila, if you can change any views around with that.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Yeah, I'm in charge.
Okay, so actually I'll take myself off pin very shortly, but I thought we'll start by introducing the rest of the fantastic panel we've got today. So looking at who we've got there. So let's go to Matthew, I can see first. So Matthew, do you want to introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about you, what you do.
Hi, Kate. Well, first I'm a little bit younger than you, around 47. I'm bespectacled and of beard is probably the best way to describe me. I've been an educator and a school leader in schools in the UK and across the world for the last 25 years, and only recently have gone into full-time consultancy. And the mission of my consultancy is that every child be able to be seen, be known, and belong. And it's infused also from my privilege to parent two adult children who are trans, and who've both come out as trans in the last 3 or 4 years. And I think I've learned more from them over the last 3 or 4 years than I have in the previous 43 years of my life on this planet. So that's Matthew. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm an educational consultant in the field of well-being and inclusivity.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Yeah, I forgot to give my pronouns there at the start. I use she, her as my pronouns. Let's go to Genevieve next, please.
Hi, yeah, I'm Genevieve. I'm 50. My pronouns are she, her, and literally quite a newbie came out about 18 months ago, but only came out of school in June and returned in September as my authentic self. I teach physics. I've been teaching for 26 years, and yeah, I think that's about it.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to hearing some of your input today. And then we go across to Lois, please.
Hi, I'm Lois. I've got glasses as well, blonde hair, and I'm 26. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm a postgraduate researcher at the University of East Anglia, which is based in Norwich in the UK. And I've been working on some research with trans and non-binary young people to explore their experiences of physical education, and PE for short, in UK secondary secondary schools. I'm also a youth support worker at a local kind of LGBTQ youth group. So I've done some work with these young people, and some of the kind of research is with these young people, and that's some of the stuff that I'll be sharing with you today. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Fantastic, thank you all. Funny enough, I do a bit of youth support work as well. It's one of those things, just because I'm passionate about, you know, this actual subject we're talking about today. So I thought we'd keep this pretty much as a discussion between us today. I've got a few points I've put down that we can talk around, and it'd be great to hear about some of the work you've all done and your, you know, individual experiences. Just bring those into it. I thought, first of all, I was thinking about, from my point of view as a trans person who grew up in the 1970s and 80s, told people at a very early age about, you know, who I was. But when I was in school and I told people at that age, quite often I would, you know, be bullied for it, or I would get told to, like, no, you can't be that no, and there was no support whatsoever. And there was no visibility at all of LGBT people generally. The only visibility I saw growing up and then into teenage years was generally what you would see in the media. There was nothing within school that ever affirmed your identity. You didn't see other people like that, and that had quite a negative effect. You know, it made school quite hard because of that in education. Not long back, just before the pandemic started, there's just something I'll put this into perspective. I had to deliver some workshops to a school in the northwest of England, and it was actually my old secondary school. And as I walked into the foyer there, they had a huge rainbow and trans flag display as I walked through that door, and I just stood there and I had to take a breath. It really moved me at that point. And I thought, what 13-year-old me would have given to see that sort of representation. And it also brought home to me how important that work is, how we need to make sure that every student, pupil within our education system sees themselves represented within that system. So I was going to start off with, anyone's got any points or thoughts around what maybe everybody thinks are the key areas that we need to be looking at when the things that need to be addressed when we're trying to ensure that educational spaces are safe and affirming for trans and non-binary identities. What are the key areas that schools and educators need to be looking at in how we make those spaces happen, how we create those spaces? Anyone want to start off with that?
Yeah, I basically have found that on this, I think the most important thing is the culture of the school. And the senior management. Like you, Kate, I grew up in a school where in the 80s, it's in the northeast, where I never been able to tell people who I really was. I don't think I would have got out alive. And certainly I didn't see any kind of positive reference to queer people in the media. I'm very lucky in the fact that the school that I'm at has an incredible ethos of inclusion, and that has been filtered down throughout the whole culture of the school. So I think that's the most important thing, is the culture within the school to change attitudes and have queer students accepted.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's really important, and that schools are visibly seen to be inclusive as well. So, you know, even in things like websites, where they're on the website where they've got their ethos and values, that they include those values, and they're talking about, you know, LGBT inclusion, and also how they tackle maybe homophobic, biphobic, transphobic bullying within their spaces. Anyone else want to? Who should we move to next? Anyone want to pipe in there?
I was just gonna say, for me, there's a deeper root to all of this, I think, and it should be a lack of conditionality. It strikes me, it's really interesting that you know, this conference, and fantastic, this conference is happening on the same day as the LGBT Alliance conference, and the hashtag LGBT with the T coming out kind of above all of that. But it strikes me also that in 2003, the Every Child Matters agenda was launched, and we were told as teachers that every child matters in the wake of the terrifying and terrible incident with Victoria Clambier. It was also the year in which Section 28 was repealed. And yet it seems to me that kids today, oftentimes in their own lives and in their schools, are kind of buffeted by the winds of performativity and normativity. They're buffeted by conditionality, and their worth and their value and their validity seem to be contingent on so many different things. So beyond, above and beneath trans inclusivity needs to be a removal of any conditionality in terms of when we affirm children and young people in their growing up. That seems to me really, really important for schools in general. I remember when I first started out in the teaching profession, some of my early experience was with hearing impaired kids and with neurodiverse kids. And all of the skills and strategies I was learning with them would equally have benefited all children and young people. And we need to remind ourselves of that as well. Some of the stuff that Lois is going to talk about, I'm sure, and the work she's doing. Anything that she has seen benefiting trans and non-binary kids would also benefit probably all children. So there's kind of a no-brainer to it as well, though I seem to be oversimplifying it. Lois.
Yeah, absolutely, Matthew. That's definitely a kind of key argument that I have through a lot of my work, that, you know, the priority with the project is to really explore what these experiences are like for trans and non-binary people in PE, but actually through creating this really inclusive environment, it's going to be way better for everyone else. Yeah, so I think really a key point is really raising that awareness and education around these experiences and kind of gender diversity. I think definitely in the PE setting, it seems that there's still, you know, it's still very much organized around that kind of gender binary approach. And I think in PE specifically, it's, you know, heightened with, you know, boys doing this and girls doing that. And I think that if we're able to, you know, increase teachers' kind of understanding and knowledge of that, then they're able to kind of change their approaches, change their activities and their lessons to be kind of engaging and inclusive to trans and non-binary, and as you say, to all sorts of other young people as well. So yeah, definitely that's a good place to start.
Yeah, the visibility you mentioned at start, Kate, is so important, isn't it? And it kind of works two ways. The kids need to see themselves in their lived and learned experience in school. They need to see themselves in the curriculum that they're being offered, in the materials they're being presented with. They need to see themselves in the teachers and the adults who work with them. They need to see themselves in I talk about the 5 C's of visibility: the curriculum, the climate, the culture, like Genevieve said, the campus, and the communication. And they need to see themselves in all of these, but they also need to be seen by all of these particular dimensions and areas. That visibility, as you've all said, is so key and makes such a difference, and benefits everybody, harms nobody, and is relatively straightforward to do.
Absolutely, it's got to be embedded right through, you know, the school on all levels. It's got to be in there, you know, like making sure from everything from, you know, making sure what is taught is inclusive and people can see, you know, within that, from everything to what's stocked in the school library to, you know, there's so many different areas where it just needs to be brought. It doesn't. Quite often, I mean, I work for an organisation that go into schools a lot and do single workshops in there, but it shouldn't really be about that. You know, in a perfect world, we wouldn't need to exist in that way. It would be a case of, it would be already embedded right through everything within education. It wouldn't mean that a school has to get a certain organisation in to teach about this one day a year or something along those lines. It should never be that case. Genevieve or anybody else got anything to add on that?
Yeah. Oh.
Sorry, no, go on.
Yeah, what you're saying about, you know, it shouldn't be once a year and something kind of compulsory. This kind of stood out in some stuff I was reading recently, that, you know, nowadays PGCEs and like teacher education courses, they do all include, you know, there's a framework from the government that kind of says that you should be including stuff around kind of gender diversity and LGBTQ inclusion. So all of these new teachers coming into the school setting are getting a much more kind of holistic and kind of fuller understanding and kind of education there. But the issue then is that if we don't have something kind of compulsory for everyone to be doing, then there's all these teachers that haven't had that same training, that same education, and what can we do to support those perhaps slightly older teachers who have the kind of intentions to you know, to be really inclusive, but just don't know how to, don't have that education. I think that's a really key point. And how can we get something out to everyone and not just those that have, you know, perhaps a senior lead that's really kind of big on this, you know, inclusion training. And I think, you know, that's the big issue, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, with all the new RSE, you know, framework coming in, and because it's so sort of new into everything at the moment, it is seeing where we go with that. I've just seen a remark we've had in the chat there from Elizabeth, which says, it's one of the reasons Section 28 was so harmful. There's no seeing or talking about any of it. I do think there's a hangover in some older educators that queer and trans issues have no place in the educational space, which we all know is nonsense, but it certainly makes an uphill struggle. And I see that a lot, actually, yeah, from a lot of the staff training I do. People, and I still hear quite often a lot of staff who think that somebody coming out as LGBT or whatever their identity, sexuality may be, is some sort of safeguarding issue. You know, constantly I hear that. I heard it 3 days ago. You know, there's still that's a great way actually of describing in that a hangover of Section 28, because we still seem to be in that place, unfortunately. Anybody else?
I was just going to say a little earlier that, you know, I think visibility is a huge tool for the LGBT community. And I understand that not everyone wants to be visible. In my own case, there wasn't much of an option. You know, it's like not like I was gay or lesbian or bi. It's like you know, which is something that is just is what you are, but it's not visible, if you like. Whereas being trans is very visible. But again, I've been incredibly lucky because I've had sort of kids saying to me, some of the sixth formers, that I'm an inspiration to other kids, and it's going to be far easier for them to do that thing. And that's every day. So, you know, the point we were making earlier, that it has to be all every day, not just one day of the year or a couple of days of the year where it's, you know, Pride Month or Trans Visibility Day. You know, it's every day for me. But it's those sort of comments that make it worth it, and the fact that I'm a hell of a lot happier. But, you know, it does need to be throughout the curriculum. Not just visibility, but I do feel that has a massive impact.
I think we're still in a place, sorry, I'll just get to you very shortly, Matthew, it just prompted a thought. I think we're still in a place, and I see it again, it's something I see with a lot of schools where, especially schools, are generally very reactive to, say somebody comes out as trans within the school, and then there's this, like some sort of trans school panic response that they reach out to everybody they possibly can and say, what do we do? Just breathe. Okay, first of all, maybe you just want to have that conversation with that young person. But ideally, schools should have things in place so they don't need to have that, hang on a minute while I go and find somebody response, that they can immediately offer, you know, some sort of support, even if that might be signposting as far as LGBT plus youth groups within the area. And also, yes, schools making sure that they use those other third sector organizations that generally exist somewhere around in the, you know, in the wider community nearby to them, because quite often it is always that sudden panicked response I see quite often. And also there's a lot of, I think there's quite a lot of fear in how to respond from a lot of educators. That's something I hear quite commonly. Sorry, Matthew, over to you for the point you were just going to make there.
I was just going to, there was a comment from Lila in the chat about not everyone feeling safe to be their authentic self, and not necessarily safe to come out. My own experience as an advocate and as an ally and as a parent of two miraculous trans kids was kind of split. So my youngest began his transition when we were living abroad. We lived abroad for 10 years, and we were then in the Middle East. And he began his transition in a society which fundamentally prohibited and negated and denied his very existence. My eldest child began her transition when she was back in the UK at university, and shortly afterwards began her career as a teacher. So she experienced her transition in a society which, in theory, should be so much more inclusive and so much more celebratory than the one in which my youngest came out with such difficulty abroad. But I think before we came back, my youngest kind of thought to some extent, maybe we would come back to a land paved with rainbows. And what I've seen when they're now both back here, I see kids who are struggling, my own two kids are struggling daily with anything from catcalling to fetishization, from having to fight for basic healthcare to having to dress to a binary in order to pass. I see it not quite the ideal that was perhaps envisaged when the Equality Act came in, 11 years ago, and that there is still so far to go. But I guess what I wanted to say is I think that there is a kind of, there are examples and reasons to hope. All the kids that I've spoken to or spoke to teachers about since I've come back to the UK, there seems to be a mass generational acceptance of gender diversity and different sexualities as a norm. They get it. It's our generation who don't get it. But my worry is that should therefore be a source of hope, shouldn't it? If that generation gets it, then they're just going to make sure everyone else gets it and the world will be a happy, great, lovely, huggy, rainbow place. But the strong winds from the media, you know, I referred to the LGBT Alliance conference, and only 2 days ago, our own Prime Minister came out in celebration of the work that the LGBT Alliance is doing. And they're hearing this, I think, minority view, but hearing it so loudly on a day-to-day basis. So ultimately, if we believe in safeguarding and child protection, which of course we do, then we have to put the well-being and the safety of each child first. That has to be our prime and sole priority. But it's really, really hard when we have this noise in the background the whole time. And I think that makes things so much harder than they perhaps need to be.
Absolutely, and at the moment it seems to be those who shout loudest seem to get noticed the more and are actually, you know, getting listened to, unfortunately and sadly. But as you say, you know, there is that hope out there, and you know, even again, it probably backs up what you just said there as well. The vast majority of educators I speak to want to make that difference. They want to make sure that they're supporting the young people, you know, within their schools. Quite often, I think some of the barriers I face is they just don't know how to. They're lacking that level of education. And you know, even though we're getting it now, so it is coming through with, you know, a lot of new teacher training now. They're basically, you know, including that in there. That there's still a generation that haven't had that support, and it's playing catch up with that. And I know occasionally we get the odd, you know, scheme that come along, or as, you know, working for charity like I do, that you get the odd charities go after certain pieces of funding which enable them to do that then and bring that training to schools. But we still have a huge gap in that knowledge, and it's how we bring that into our schools and help address the misconceptions and take away the fear for a lot of educators in how they approach it, because sometimes it can be they're afraid of what parents think. That's always the number one, which as well, I say to that, for every time any educator you worry about parental worries or concerns or how parents will react, remember that 10 to 14% of your parents will probably be from an LGBT family or the LGBT community. And some of those, you know, those parents and those families are trans too, and have trans people in them too. So you've got to include everyone. You've got to show everybody's family is, you know, is visible within that space as well. It's that thing about inclusion, about visibility again. Quite often as well in the recent years, and those anti-trans groups talk about the huge rise in young trans people coming out. We know the fact that that's the case because trans people are more visible now. As I said, when I was younger, I didn't see anyone like me. Was I going to come out? Not a chance. Not one, not even, you know, a drop that I was going to come out. Now we see trans people in the media, and we see quite a lot of positive trans role models out there. And if people see those people who represent themselves, who are like them, that's going to give them that confidence. Unfortunately, if they do come out at the moment, there are still spaces that they don't see themselves in. So they might see themselves outside of school in various other youth groups, etc., LGBT youth groups, but then they might get into that school environment. And I see a case with a lot of young people where they put themselves back into the closet when they're in school. And then when they're out of school, they feel comfortable to be themselves again. And that's a horrible situation. That's wrenching yourself from one situation to another. Because I've been in that case when I remember first coming out, I was trying to almost live two lives at one point. It's not good for anybody's mental health, well-being and resilience overall. Sorry, I went on a bit there.
I just wanted to come back to something that Matthew said, that about the change in how kids react. I remember when I first started teaching, if someone had actually had the bravery to come out, because it was bravery at the time, I suppose it still is, but they would be ripped apart. And I certainly, as soon as you came, I would not have dreamed of coming out then, because I simply wouldn't have had a career in teaching. It was not long after close 28 the attitude was still very much prevalent. But now, you know, you talk to kids and they are incredibly accepting, this generation. They have no qualms at all. In fact, you know, I've seen some teachers years ago basically put kids down and make sort of homophobic remarks to try and quieten them, to show them up. That it would work. It wasn't right, but it worked. But nowadays, you say something like to a kid like the sort of a couple of guys, you know, sitting too close or something. And if you turn around and said, "Get a room," they'd say, "Well, if you let us leave, we will." And so they're straight back at you. So it is completely normalised to them, which is brilliant.
The kids are teaching the teachers.
Certainly, yes, they are. Yeah,
that's a really good point, and you know, it's quite often is the case. Even within working with LGBT youth groups, I quite often see young people come up to me and with new language in how they identify themselves, and it's really important that when that happens, you really affirm their identities when they say, "This is who I am." You don't say, "Oh, I've not heard that term. That's not real. It's not in the dictionary." Yeah, language changes, language evolves. Different people always come up with new terms on how to describe themselves. And if somebody describes themselves in a certain way, uses a certain word to identify that, then that's fine. That's their identity. Their identity is valid, and we should always respect that. That's sort of really important point. I'm just making a note to anybody who is watching who might have questions. We're getting a few questions through in the chat there. Please throw your questions at us. It's really good that we can help share some practice with you and some of our experiences in that way. We're getting a few in here, which I'm going to bring into it. In fact, actually, there's one there. What are some of the outstanding practices that any of us may have seen of making people or making adults, even staff, you could say as well, bring that into this, and young people feel safe and included within education? Anyone seen any particular outstanding practice that they'd like to highlight?
My experience in the UK is very, very recent because I was away for so long. So I don't know if I can bring those examples, but I had a conversation with a school that's invited me potentially to be one of their board members recently. And one of the first questions I asked them was, how do you include your trans and non-binary pupils? And they said, all of the kids are talking about their pronouns, and the kids can wear whichever uniform they want to. And we've got a new member of staff whose role is as an LGBTQ plus advocate, and that's their main responsibility. And it strikes me that, we talked about how lots of staff are hungry to do something better, but hungry to know more, and they just don't feel they know enough. But I wonder whether there are also schools out there who think that they've got this, who would say, yep, we're completely inclusive, we got this cracked, we've sorted this. And they forget what I would call the silent semiotics of exclusivity, a school that thinks it's really, really trans inclusive, but it is, I don't know, it has two uniforms, or it thinks it's really, really trans inclusive, but it groups kids on a binary. They think they're really trans inclusive, but you'd be struggled to find any book in the entire school library that gave visibility to that trans identity. So I think we need to be aware, just as we need to be aware of teachers who are really hungry to know more, and we've got to give that differentiated quality training. We need to be wary of those schools perhaps who are a little complacent and think they've got this sorted when it may be superficial.
Absolutely. I see that in single-sex schools that are trying to be inclusive quite a lot, because they sort of struggle with, we're labelled as this boys or girls school, and how do we support those young people? And they see them really trying, but then I saw it in a workshop once. I saw a young person actually call their teacher out on something that they did within school, as the staff did. They said, yes, miss, you're really supportive of our trans students, but every morning if we have an assembly, you say, good morning, girls. And you talk about the values of being insert whatever their school name is, of being a such and such girl. And that doesn't support my friend who sat next to me. And that had a really, I mean, I saw that impact that had on that teacher at the time. And that was actually, again, the thing of students actually teaching the teachers. But yeah, that was just a small example, because what you said then just lit that memory up in there.
You know what else I would have taught, and this isn't trans specific, but what I'd have taught is the phenomenon of the moral panic. I'm still working through Sean Fay's amazing book at the moment, and I have to read it in short bouts because I get too angry otherwise. But I'd have kids talk about how a moral panic is constructed, who it serves, how to see how it grows, and how to put those flames out, because that could apply to any tyranny over one of the protected characteristics, and it certainly applies to our trans and non-binary kids. But if they understood the nature of the moral panic, then they could see what was happening around them for what it is, rather than feel like it's the mainstay or that it is the majority voice.
Absolutely. Anybody else want to comment on that at all? Because I noticed I'm just doing a lot of talking there.
Sorry.
No, I'm doing a lot of talking and you're doing a lot of talking, but I just want to make sure everybody else has a voice.
Just going back to the question around kind of outstanding practice, I have quite a nice example I thought I'd share. From one young person at the youth group that I work with, they identify as non-binary, and they talked about their different school experiences moving from one high school to another, in terms of the PE context, because this is what we were kind of talking about. And in the first school, really awful experience, uniforms, certain activities for boys and girls, really uncomfortable kind of public changing settings, and they just absolutely hated PE and had the worst time, did anything to get out of it for all those reasons. They moved to a different school where you wear your own kit, you choose whatever activity you want to do, and there's no division based around kind of gender, and having that kind of that freedom, that choice, was really affirming and really empowering for this young person. And they went from hating PE as a subject to absolutely loving it, from these really simple changes of just having more choice and removing those kind of gendered aspects from it. And I just wanted to share that, because they're simple things, but they made such a huge difference to this young person's life. And I think a lot more educators could take on those kind of simple practices in their own time.
So much of that prevalent heteronormativity and cisnormativity right through right through society as a whole, not even just within education. And it's I'd never use that word. I don't use normalize much, but I always use usualizing a lot. Hi, Sue Sanders, if you're watching. It's about just making things more usual. What the hell is normal? But it's always those like cis and hetero things that in everything, when we're looking again, going back to things like the curriculum, you're talking about PE being very boy girl still all the time. I've seen so many schools really struggle with that, with PE, and how do they make sure they're including non-binary students on many levels, and just also how they just support trans students in just feeling comfortable to engage in sport as well, in lots of places, because the media doesn't help on that as well, I have to say, because obviously those young people are impacted by what they see outside of school as well. and that has a really sort of a negative effect. I've done a lot of work recently with some workshops I did around young people, LGBT inclusion in athletics and sport. We did tied in with the Athletics Pride Network to do some workshops, which are really productive actually, because we're hearing some really positive views from young people, not just LGBT, but about how LGBT young people should be included in sport, which is really important and actually contradicts a lot of what you see put out there in the mainstream.
I think the power of the PE menu in schools, the sports menu, is brilliant. If kids are just given that menu of activities, my youngest, my son, chose boxing when offered a PE menu. And he didn't choose it because it was a boys' sport or a girls' sport. It was just something on the PE menu that really appealed to him. So that's an example of really simple things that you can do. There's a question from Jessica there, though, about how you balance the need for visibility and dignity with taking care of yourself, that cultural inertia, the putback and the moral panic that we talked about. And I suppose my own kids are very activist in their mindset, and I'm amazed by the strength and the volume of the voice that they have. But there'll be many other trans and non-binary kids who don't want to be a flag waver and an activist. They just want to live their life. And the same for teachers. You know, there'll be many teachers who will be inspiration for their trans and non-binary kids, but there'll be other trans and non-binary teachers who just want to kind of get on with their working life and not be there in the spotlight. And we have to be able to accommodate both, I guess.
That's incredibly true, because yeah, I know, coming from where I do it, because I'm an activist with a lot of different organizations outside of my work in education, and I get to that point where I experience burnout a lot because I'm rubbish at putting actually my own personal boundaries in place. And I see that happen with a lot of colleagues, you know, who, you know, are very activism focused, but are also trying to get on with, you know, that career within education that they're holding down too. So it can be a really fine line sometimes. I find it a really tricky thing to achieve personally. I'm just looking at, sorry, I'm just zooming past through some of the remarks. You've talked about, you know, other simple things as well. And I think we mentioned uniform. I quite often get asked about uniform, and people as well. There's assumptions around what makes inclusive uniform, and quite often I hear people saying, "Oh, we've just made it all trousers now as far as uniform." I'm saying that's not quite it. You know, it's. I mean, I always found the simplest option around inclusion in uniform is just take gender away from uniform. You've got uniform. If you have uniform, you've got trousers, your skirts, your whatever, as long as it's your uniform code, but just take the gender away and let those young people pick from that uniform.
It's a menu want. Again, isn't it? It's just offering a menu.
That's it. It's absolutely, you know, that. And it's also sometimes, I would say, with how some schools may respond to supporting young trans people, they can quite often think that every young trans person fits a particular mode, so they'll try and fit every single person into that mold or stereotype of a trans person. We talk about trying to break stereotypes, but also people stereotype trans people, and sometimes I see where there might be responses and how you support a young person. And I wrote some guidance for the ATL years ago, which is, I think bits of it are now rolled into the NEU one, and I put in I was really quite passionate about putting in there about making sure we have a child-centered approach when there's a young person comes out, and we listen to them and we go, what do you need? We ask them and if we can make those reasonable adjustments to support that young person, you know, as we should be anyway, as far as, you know, responsibilities that are statutory under things like the Equality Act, that, you know, we need to be thinking of those young people as individuals and not just throwing, you know, having our piece of trans guidance from whatever organization it is and saying, let's go by this. I mean, those guidance documents, depending on where you get them from, fantastic stuff, but we still need to be treating each child as an individual, each young person there, and asking them what they need, finding out what they need, and supporting it if at all we can, you know, make those adjustments to do that.
You mentioned the Equality Act there, and I feel that we need to protect the Equality Act rather than only its characteristics, although those it professes to enshrine. Because, you know, when I lived in the Middle East, we'd given anything to have a legal act which specified the characteristics which should be protected by law. And here we have one, but we got to a point where the belief that any of those characteristics doesn't exist is almost a protected belief. And so the whole thing is kind of at risk of being kind of bastardized and contorted. And we need to keep our eye out for that as well. And I think that conversation can be had with children and young people as well. How many curricula explicitly teach the intention and the evolution of the Equality Act, and how it can be used for ill as well as for good?
I've actually seen some that actually are now. Well,
Wow.
Some schools I worked with recently, I've seen where they'll actually run an equality group. So within the school, and I think this is a good idea as well. Just that thing about promoting each other's understandings of maybe different protected characteristics. So lots of schools starting to have either rainbow clubs or LGBT groups or focus groups, which is great, which gives that safe space for those young people to meet others like them and to build up that confidence maybe through that sort of networking with others who are like them within school, but also wider equality groups that within school that cover lots of different protected characteristics, which enable lots of different people to learn about each other. It's that thing's about celebrating our differences again. You know,
like Lila referred to intersectionality there, and you know,
yeah,
in the week where we're being told as teachers we cannot teach that white privilege is a thing, we need to make sure our eyes are wide open to the importance of intersectionality when discussing any of this. And any of you who've not seen the work of the Diverse Educators group, by the way, have a look at Diverse Educators, because there's amazing stuff that those guys are doing for intersectionality and for all of the characteristics that we're standing up for today.
Lois or Genevieve, anything to sort of add to those points?
I was just about you said about the having LGBT groups in school. I actually am setting one up at the moment, but I don't know how other schools do it, but I'm certainly encouraging non-LGBT kids to come along as well, and be allies to those kids, and see that, you know, so they can basically spread the positive messages throughout the school.
Thank you.
There's a kind of an American concept of the GSA, the Gay Straight Alliance, was a thing in American schools, I think, before it was here, and then is becoming the Gender and Sexuality Alliance. And I think you can find some of the most powerful allies for our trans and non-binary kids amongst their peers and the kids younger than them in schools as anywhere else. So we need to get those allies amplified and enfranchised, as well as kids with those identities themselves.
Well, I want to sort of make it part of the culture of the school that, you know, if there is any homophobia or transphobia going on, that it is stamped out by the peers. So they will be an ally, because part of being an ally is basically not just defending or sticking up for LGBT plus students when they're there, but also when they're not there. Which you find some people don't do because they don't feel like they have to, because there's no one to defend sort of in front of them. But, you know, I want them to be able to say, well, no, what you're saying isn't right, whether they're there or not.
Yeah, at the moment, especially in the UK, we're really experiencing this massive transphobic pile on at the moment, you know, and we're seeing that from these anti-trans groups, and actually schools are getting their fair share of that too. I live in Wales, and I do a fair bit of work within Wales, and I've seen a situation, I think it was over lockdown, there were schools that were bombarded by letters from certain organisations. I'm not even going to name them here because I don't want to even give them the exposure that people go and look them up, but who send out pseudo advice to that's the only way I could put it. It's basically misinformation around support for schools, and you know, that sort of thing needs to be tackled. And I think we need to. It'd be good if we could also give teachers the knowledge to filter that stuff out. I've seen Lila pop up there, which means we're near the end. I just want to probably ask one last question, but this is probably a big one. And if you can't, how do you think we can measure the success of being in, you know, of trans inclusion? How do you think we can measure when we're at a point where we can see we're really making those positive steps forward, or we're getting to that point where we think, yeah, we're close now? Anybody got any ideas on how can we measure success with that? Or do you think there are any barriers to that we need to overcome?
I can think from, again, a kind of PE perspective, and one of the reasons why I began exploring this particular area was because looking at statistics of kind of older populations of trans and non-binary people in terms of their engagement and participation in sport and physical activity, this was kind of one of the lowest groups in terms of their kind of levels of physical activity. So from a very kind of empirical research perspective, if PE became more inclusive, I think we would see that lots of young people have got these much more positive connections to kind of healthy, active lives. And again, that might be through kind of studies and surveys to find out those results. But that's kind of how I'd measure it in my own context anyway.
I was going to say that the measurement of the things that really matter is, I'm working on a project with diverse educators about how we can use data for good rather than for evil. And so I don't have an answer to the question, Kate, but I certainly plan on exploring one over the next few months. So watch this space.
No problem. Any final comments? And then on to, sorry, go on, Genevieve.
Sorry, I would say that, we're getting pretty close to the school. I'm very incredibly lucky. Out of 1,700 kids, I've had 3 incidents, and they were very, very easily dealt with. So it's not, and I think I've had 1 complaint from a parent which was made up, and I wouldn't be sure that it was because they were transphobic, but because it was completely made up, we found. I would imagine that is why, but that's sort of out of like thousands of parents. All of the kids are incredibly supportive, and I think that just shows the massively good culture and change in ideas over the last few years. A lot more needs to be done, but I think if you're on that road where you're getting very few incidents of transphobic or homophobic behaviour, you must be doing something right.
Thank you. And with that, we're out of time. So I want to thank you all for such a great conversation. And over to our host again. Over to you, Lila.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant conversation. And I just gained so much from each and every one of you. First of all, Kate, fantastic job chairing, but I knew that would be the case. Otherwise, I wouldn't have called on you last minute, and you deliver like every time.
And it was last minute.
It really was, but I'm so grateful. And also Schools Out, which you are part of, the National Management Committee, helped us launch the very first Pride in Education conference last year. So it's a sustained relationship that we've had. Matthew, your enthusiasm is contagious, and I'm glad you mentioned Hannah Wilson and diverse educators. They're absolutely phenomenal. There's actually a fantastic conference that she's organizing on the 12th of November called Diversifying the Curriculum, which I will put in the newsletter. I think it was in the last newsletter, but Pride in Education newsletter comes out monthly with loads of tips, resources. Lois, I want to learn. I want to be in your class. I just want you to be my teacher. Like all of you have got so much passion and enthusiasm for just wanting the kids to learn. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what we want. We don't want to be bogged down with all these battles, because that's what they are. And Genevieve, I commend you for your bravery, and I'm really, really happy to hear that you are in a supportive environment, and the comments are echoing. So you're all doing a superb job. Thank you, everyone. Really, really good. So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for dedicating your Saturday afternoon on the first Saturday of half term, for being here in the conference, contributing and attending. And we've had people from all over the world. We've had people from the Middle East, which is where you said you used to be based. We did a little poll earlier. We've had people from, let me just double check, North America. And last night we had people from Africa as well. Mostly people who are either parents, author, educators or educational leaders. And I hope that you got a lot out of it. So thank you so very much.